My name is Sterling Hart, and this is Dreamlight, where we explore dream interpretation. Dream buildings often represent the self, but what do dreams of cities or cityscapes mean? Cities are usually a larger sense of self, so society, your community, the world around you in a bigger sense. What is your relation to the city that you live in? There can be many answers, but generally you either feel part of it or you don't. Some people are really engaged in their communities through schools or a church or some organization, but here we want to look at dream about cities rather than a specific community. Notice that sometimes you can navigate and know things about a person by knowing what part of the city they come from. So it can be said somebody comes from the wrong side of the tracks, or they come from an upscale community. So they'll usually have these places where like Goose Hill is a certain class of people, or a place like Bowman Woods is the up-and-coming community. Even some cities have absorbed other communities into them, and so they're actually naming something that was formerly a town. So sometimes we're very aware of the history of the city and we know cultural things about it. So for instance, some cities in their past had things like, say, the Czech language for the street signs as well as the English. Sometimes we don't really know much about the city that we're actually living in. A city can be part of your identity, but it is often vague. So it would tend to mean the nebulous connection to the world at large. For instance, my friend R dreamed that she was in the parking lot of a grocery store and then went driving and was lost in the city. She kept seeing places that looked familiar, but she knew that she'd never been there. And then in the end, she arrived at an overlook and could see the city stretched out below her. When we take the dream, we break it down into elements. There's the parking lot, the grocery store, driving, being lost, familiar places, inner knowing, the overlook, and the view of the city. So we want to have the strategy of questioning. What do you think about the grocery store? The parking lot? Have you been lost recently? Do you feel lost? What about familiar places? Have you ever been to an overlook? Does it remind you of the city you live in or of another city? Have you lived in other cities for any length of time? What about cities in general? So R thought that the parking lot reminded her of the grocery store she used to shop at. She used to live in another city, but she had moved across the country for her job. The grocery store was a cooperative, and she would often run into people that she knew there. One of the things that she noticed is where she currently shops, for about 5 years, she doesn't run into people that she knows there. But she still catches herself looking for familiar cars when she drives into the parking lot. For the lost part, she really didn't feel lost. She uses an app and gets around pretty well. So then the question was asked, do you feel you have lost something? And this struck her because she felt the loss of her friends. She had new friends from work, but she didn't have the same kind of neighbors in relation to the neighborhood, the same kind of community. When she lived in the other city, she often met people because she lived in different apartments. And currently she owned her own house, but she actually didn't really know the people living on either side of her or other people on the block. What about driving around and seeing familiar places? This brought up the thought that many of the places looked the same. There was no unique places, and many of the same franchise stores were just repeated. She lived and worked in a fairly new part of her city, but one of the things she noticed was in her former city there were layers, different neighborhoods were from different time periods because they had different architectural styles. And so when you drove from one area to another, it was really noticeable. She associated the inner knowing with trying to keep her mind open. She had an active practice of aiming to be open to new things. So it reminded her that she went through phases of trying to take different routes to get to places like the grocery store so she wouldn't fall into ruts. The overlook reminded her of two things. One was a trip she made to a state park along the Mississippi River. It was raining, and she went out onto this overlook in the rain for a view of the river, and it gave her this really timeless feeling. The other was the city as a backdrop on Zoom or late-night TV talk shows. This struck her as an idea of a lot happening, nightlife going on. So the city's always busy. So there was a tension between these two associations, the river and the busy city nightscape. This brought up her job where she was settled, and there wasn't much opportunity for advancement. She was comfortable, but if she wanted to further her career, she would need to take some risk and change jobs. She wasn't sure that's what she wanted, but she hadn't really considered a change in terms of where she lived in her community. She really didn't know what was possible, what was out there. So the dream was catching this subconscious undercurrent, and it let her think more about these feelings as they came up. She could see what was kind of really underneath the feeling of needing to maybe make a change or make a decision about it. In another example, one of my dreams, I dreamed that I saw this off-road vehicle. And then suddenly I was in the vehicle and we were going up and down over hills and the physics didn't seem quite right. We were flying higher than we should, landing softer. Everything was bright orange dunes and the colors were oversaturated, including the sky. In the distance, I could see a city between the mountains. The mountains and the city were dark against the sky. So in the dream, it seemed like maybe somebody was there, just kind of that feeling of you're with somebody, but nobody in particular. In the dream, I really wasn't driving. I was just in the passenger seat when I went to first person. So when we look at the elements, we have the off-road vehicle, we have the roads itself, the hills, the physics, the orange dunes, the saturated colors, and then the city and the mountains and the darkness. That change from third to first person. What do I think of perspective changes? The first view was like an establishing shot in a movie. So it tells me where I am and what's going on. Then I'm in the situation. The off-road vehicle and the whole dream seemed very science fiction to me. I would never kind of drive that kind of vehicle in real life. I wouldn't go tearing around the dunes. But in the dream, it has kind of this allure of adventure. What about the physics? It seems off in a way like a video game or the Hobbit movie where the physics of movement and what happens doesn't seem to be realistic. There seems to be less gravity. And to me, that means another world or perhaps another plane. What about the orange dunes? The color also seemed kind of otherworldly to me, and the bright colors and the vividness in the dream seemed to indicate another plane. The other association kind of with the colors is like when I walk in the woods and it's raining, the colors are all different. And that brings kind of this, you're a little more present in the situation. It's a little more vivid. You're a little more there. And that has that otherworldly feeling. What does another plane mean? To me, it would indicate the dream is more like subliminal experience of some subtle world, the place where intuition and precognition comes from. What about the city and the mountains? The dark, distant mountains remind me of a tarot deck, the Elemental deck by Carolyn Smith and John Astrop. That has the reoccurring symbols of dark mountains in the horizon. And it represents the future and the unknown potential. The city itself seems like a symbol of a city. There's nothing spread out around it, no farms or sprawl. So that strikes me as a collection of stories I read when I was young, about 11 or 12, called Cities in Flight by James Blish. The stories revolve around cities that create anti-gravity engines and then fly around and land on different planets to exploit the resources and provide manufacturing. What did the stories mean to you? I think as a kid growing up in the country, there was a kind of awe to think of faraway places with dense populations and all this activity going on. So it was a kind of call to the future in faraway places, a kind of sentiment. So I always like the images. Sometimes you see them in the Star Wars movies where you just see the cars are constantly going by and there's all this life going on. And it's really just kind of a backdrop to whatever the scene is with the characters. So I took this, in the end, to be kind of a prescient dream, showing me some possibility that I was headed for. Within about a year, I had an opportunity to travel in India, which was greater than my means at the time of the dream. So in a sense, the dream was showing me things. Of course, it's not showing me any, actionable details. But there's this sense of this big change coming. The city itself represents a power of possibility of life experience. So when we have dreams about cities, it can really be a symbol and a connection to worlds and people and communities rather than being a specific one. So if you dream of New York City, that would be really kind of different than if you dreamed of just some sort of archetypical city. If you're dreaming of New York, then you have maybe all these associations with it. Maybe you've been there. Maybe you're thinking about the Statue of Liberty. Maybe you're thinking about Broadway and plays or Wall Street. So there's all these things that potentially are there that you can experience. So that's one of the things you want to look at is, again, there's a difference between kind of this general vague idea of a symbol of a city and this idea of a specific kind of community or organization that you want to connect to, or an activity. That's really one of the things that you're kind of looking at with dreams of cities. If you have any cool dreams of cities you want to share, comment below. If you like this video, please hit the thumbs up. If you want more dreams, please hit the subscribe. I'm Sterling Hart, and thanks for coming.